established in 1997 to provide for the welfare and sanctuary of the horses and burros there, to educate about the natural history of wild horses and burros, as well as management challenges of these beloved animals on public lands. And we guide people in being part of the public process of public. Because we are a closed system with facilities like alleyways and small sorting paddocks and livestock chutes, we can capture data pretty readily. We know each of our horses as individuals, so we can identify them and know their histories and who they're related to. We can draw blood, perform necropsies on a horse that is recently deceased, or collect hair and fecal samples easily, and we know exactly from which horse they're from. Further, we work both on-site and off-site to synthesize our data and experience towards better, less invasive wild horse and burro management techniques. We've been using the immune contraceptive vaccine PZP, or porcine zona pellucida, to stabilize and manage our own herd growth since 1999. And as you can see from the numbers there, we have quite a few horses and burros at 4 satellite sanctuaries. I also want to say that as I tell the following story, there are folks signed up for this webinar who have vastly more or different knowledge than I do. This will in no way cover every angle or aspect. Comprehensive horse and wildlife fertility control and its eventual application towards wild horse and burro management is a lot more involved than a webinar and would require quite a few more people. I keep trying to refine how I tell this story, and I hope that if you as listeners and researchers, land managers, and practitioners have additions or edits to the narrative, that you'll participate via the question and answer period at the end, or shoot me or Botstiber an email so we can arrange to speak further. I already have interesting spayback stories from Mark Fraker about the early work done in seals that were fascinating and delightful, and I'm going to have to add that in another time, but these are the sorts of things I want to keep building upon. Anyway, I know folks involved in the wild horse and burro issue are not shy, so I expect animated and ongoing conversation. Go ahead to the next slide. We have wild horses and burros in 10 Western states. 55 million years ago, horses began their journey as the dawn horse, or Eohippus, right here in what is now the United States. And over many millions of years, they adapted and evolved to changing conditions. And they migrated all around the globe, with the exception of the poles in Australia. They moved back and forth across the Bering Land Bridge many times, but 10 to 12,000 years ago, during an ice age, they and many other large land mammals did become extinct from North America. Mustang is the Spanish word, is from the Spanish word musteño, and literally translated means horse without a home. Horses returned to the North American continent in the 1500s with first Spanish and soon after European explorers. Horses were released or escaped and intermixed and repopulated the land, and these are the ancestors of today's wild horses, those horses we refer to as Mustangs. In the 1950s, or so the story goes, a woman named Velma Johnson, who I think everybody knows would later be known as Wild Horse Annie, she grew curious while following a large truck that looked like it was loaded with animals, and there was blood dripping out of the back of it. So she became curious and followed that truck. And what offloaded were horses at a slaughter facility. Got her thinking about, well, where did these horses come from, and who had responsibility for them, and why were they ending up at a slaughterhouse? Basically, what she found was that unwanted horses on public or private lands, and remember this is back in the 50s, be disposed of in any manner anyone wanted. So there were essentially no rules and no one responsible. Horses could be gathered for ranch work, they could be shot, or they could be sold for slaughter. He began campaigning for the federal protections for horses and burros. And in 1971, and with a huge amount of public support, the Wild and Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act was passed. And I just need to say the quote from the late Dr. J. Kirkpatrick on this slide is not meant to be disparaging, but to show that the layers and complexity of managing horses and burros is not straightforward. So next slide, we'll get into some of the nitty-gritties. Various natural resource agencies have varying tasks and oversight and responsibilities for and on different parts of our public lands. Wild horses and burros exist on lands administered by each of these agencies, but it is the Bureau of Land Management under the Department of the Interior, which is the battleship, as it were, of wild horse and burro management agencies, with most animals on the most land to manage. It is mandated to manage and protect these animals on BLM land and to work with other agencies to do so on their land. Unsurprisingly, to some of you, federal and state agencies do not always play well together. I say this with some amount of fondness, having worked for both federal and state agencies. So how does the BLM manage wild horses and burros? There are 177 herd management areas of various sizes on BLM land where wild horses are present and managed for today. In each of those areas, an appropriate management level, or AML, is determined. And this will be the number of horses or burros that the land can sustain alongside any other of the multiple uses happening on that same land. And then this is analyzed against soil type, water availability, climate, forage availability, and habitat type. When the numbers of horses exceed an appropriate management level determined for that herd management area, they are considered excess. However many are above the appropriate management level are rounded up with a helicopter, processed and separated by sex at a short-term holding facility, and either adopted or eventually make their way to a long-term pasture. 3 to 5 years later, your population on that particular herd management area has risen again, and it may be that you're needing to repeat the entire process. This conceptually can just go on and on. You're essentially chasing your tail, and the cost for this is extraordinary. Next slide. This is where BLM's wild horse and burro program budget is allocated by necessity. The x-axis across the bottom is the number of horses in short and long-term holding. And the y-axis is the annual budget allocation in millions of dollars. This is sort of a no-duh graph. In other words, it's pretty clear that if you have a lot of horses in holding, then it probably costs a great deal to care for them. In fact, close to 70% of the BLM's annual wild horse and burro program budget goes to caring for horses in holding. Next slide. This shows the percentage of the annual budget allocated to fertility control, that's the gray bars, per year, plotted alongside the number of horses and burros on the range, that's the black dots. Though fertility control is a valuable tool in terms of managing populations, BLM, in this case, though other agencies as well, have not been strategic about its implementation. Please know that I'm well aware of 2020 hindsight, and I don't mean this as an attack. This is just sort of, it is what it is. Today, with the number of horses on BLM lands estimated at 88,000 on range, the easy implementation of fertility control has now become quite difficult. But let's back up and talk about fertility control and wildlife in general. So next slide. In the 1970s and 80s, real thought and interest by conservation biologists, researchers, and reproductive physiologists went into developing methods for wildlife fertility control. As a series of conferences about wildlife fertility control that began about this time, all of these folks started looking for what would be responsible, ethical, and useful parameters for wildlife fertility control. Came up with these bullet points here. Once it was recognized that this could actually be used as a population management tool, effort went into being ecologically and behaviorally sensitive. Again, these are the listed parameters that were developed at these wildlife fertility conferences. Next slide. Hormonal fertility control was being used in wildlife dating back to about the 1960s with implants and oral delivery of estrogens and progestins. This was happening alongside the emergence of human contraception. In the early 1970s, research showed that ZP, or zona pellucida, the protein coating all mammalian eggs, could be useful as a contraceptive vaccine. Wildlife fertility control pioneers Drs. John Turner and Jay Kirkpatrick were working in Celeste, Idaho, investigating using steroids to control fertility in wild stallions. This process, though, required helicopters. They would literally fly over the animals and dart them with an anesthetic, and then descend out of the helicopters, and they had to administer huge doses of a thick steroid drug. So in essence, the practicality and safety issues surrounding this made it rather infeasible. Shortly after the passage of the Wild Horse and Burro Act, a BLM horse program specialist named Ron Hall asked Jay if he could stop horses from breeding. Jay asked why. Ron explained about the 1971 Act and how he thought controlling fertility was the answer. Horse reproduction would soon outpace adoption. But meanwhile, as that was going on, there was theoretical work to see if human contraceptive vaccines might be developed from ZP proteins. And that's what led to a surge in this research in general and in animals. In humans, the answer to this was eventually no, because of the unpredictability of the duration of infertility and the lower efficacy than hormonal contraceptive. So the work with ZP proteins continued with other species. Dr. Irwin Liu of UC Davis showed that PZP worked as a contraceptive in captive horses, and that was in the late 80s. Around that same time, Drs. John Turner, Jay Kirkpatrick, and Irwin Liu showed the efficacy in wild horses darting remotely. The tests on captive horses and deer, there was also late 80s work of PZP on captive deer in Ohio. That work led respectively to management utilizing remotely delivered fertility control for wild horses on Assateague Island National Seashore, that began in the late 80s, as well as wild deer on Fire Island National Seashore in New York in the early 90s. Both of those are national parks administrated. Deer and dozens of captive wildlife were added to the list in the 2000s, and then free-ranging elephants and North American elk. Today, more than 80 species have successfully received PZP vaccination, and one species, the naked mole rat, has received PZP, but I don't have the results of that. PZP is not all there is, but ZP proteins were the start of what might be considered acceptable, applicable, and proven towards effective reproductive management of wild horses and burros. So next slide. I'm not going to go into great detail on any of these, but there are different mechanisms towards fertility control. So we talked a little bit about steroids. Those are going to suppress the final stages of follicle growth or ovulation in females, or they'll reduce sperm production and or motility in males. We also have immunocontraceptive vaccines that will elicit an antibody response to the zona pellucida such that fertilization cannot occur. And there are 3 listed right there that are in various levels of use or study. And then we also have gonadotropin releasing hormone agonists. So gonadotropin is, or gonadotropin releasing hormone is part of the hormone cascade that occurs and which ultimately results in fertilization being successful. An agonist would interrupt that cascade. Some of those are listed there. And then, of course, spaying and neutering is a fertility control option, and that's removal of the reproductive organs. To reiterate, these are mechanisms or modalities. It's not a comprehensive list, and this is not advocating for one or another. This is purely informational. So next slide. These are projects funded by the Bureau of Land Management. And again, this is not a comprehensive list of all wildlife fertility control research. And I'm not going to go into detail of each one of these bullets, don't worry. But it is to show that the BLM does continue to pursue different mechanisms for longer acting fertility control options. This is where things get sticky because what we each consider acceptable or humane is going to be wide-ranging. Much as our tolerances and visions of what public lands should be used for is wide-ranging, the complexity of wild horse and burro management is evident in each and every step of the way. Of particular note are the contentious efforts to research feasibility and behavior ramifications of surgical spays on wild mares. And that, I think, is something we can get into during the question and answer session. You see in red, it's written about when equus becoming pop equus. This is an effort trying for land managers to try to analyze management options to any other degree above a very basic level requires a lot of calculations coming from every different angle. Obviously, population growth and what's happening to that based on which sort of management technique you might be using. In the past, a program called When Equus was utilized, but this only analyzed gather removal strategies. The USGS is developing the next generation of horse and burro population modeling called Pop Equus, and that will be able to analyze much more complex interactions, including fertility control and financial projections. That's going to be an important tool. Go ahead to the next slide. So can fertility control save the day? I know the chart at the bottom of this slide is small, but in just focusing on those columns which show population increasing on the range from year to year, the annual wild horse and burro budget allocation increasing for the and the tiny numbers of horses treated with any sort of fertility control, plus the fraction of the budget available to spend on fertility control. These are the three things that we learned. Gather and removal as the management paradigm accomplishes nothing in the long term. Fertility control doesn't and cannot work when it's not applied. And populations continue to grow unless and until you address reproduction. Go ahead to the next slide. So this is just an example, and basically showing that unless multi-pronged management is utilized, stabilizing and dropping populations is almost impossible to achieve. This is solely a function of exponential growth, time, and what is actually accomplishable. That's the key part right there. You can plug in different parameters, obviously, to the calculations that go into making this graph and get different outcomes. For example, if you're going to plug in that you are able to apply fertility control to 90% of your mares, you're going to get a better outcome, of course. But I was trying to utilize numbers that are relatively achievable and with a positivity behind them, that these things would be accomplishable. So if we look at it sort of within that context and assume a 17% population growth rate and a starting population of 95,000 horses, again, this is the 20,000 foot view of an entire population, but the lessons and the patterns are similar for even slightly different inputs. Green line is going to represent your status quo. So removals only, gather removals, and for argument's sake, we're going to put in an average of 12,000 horses a year. Even removing 12,000 horses a year, your population is still going to climb because you're not even removing the number of foals that are born each. And if we look at the yellow line, and that represents fertility control only, and again, I'm going to try to be logical in my approach and think about what would be accomplishable. So I'm going to say that for argument's sake, we're going to treat 10,000 mares a year with, in this case, PZP, just to model conservatively, or something very like PZP. And in 5 or 6 years, we scale up to 15,000 mares a year, and we see that the population will still continue to rise even with that. So the blue line represents a combination of approaches, wherein you're scaling up fertility control alongside gather removals. And then you would, if you front loaded your removals with more horses, then you would be able to drop that removal down drastically. But you would also have to be beginning your fertility controls, kind of scaling in the inverse, starting a little slower, but ramping up to about 10,000 a year after that. Again, all of these inputs can change. This just gives us something we can analyze against financial considerations. Again, this is a complete population-wide graph. Obviously, if you look at smaller numbers of horses and the distinct management challenges of different HMAs or herd management areas, you're going to be able to manipulate this differently. But the moral of the story doesn't change. And that is 5 points. Fertility control is part of the solution, and it's a very important part. Fertility control cannot, at this point, work by itself. Gather and removal cannot work by itself either. You have to combine management options, and you can accomplish population stabilization and sustainable population non-lethally. Does this mean that our mission is accomplished and we can all go home? Unfortunately, no. There are very real constraints of time and circumstance. For example, where do horses go that are gathered, especially if you were going to front load your gathers? There is contentiousness around every move that the BLM makes and every gather, and there are regional politics surrounding each of these gathers. There are financial considerations. If the BLM or Forest Service has money allocated for a gather, but they do not have money allocated for applying fertility control, how can they apply fertility control alongside a gather? If there's not the appetite in that particular region for horses to be treated and released, how do we get around that hurdle? And then we also have the challenge of a changing landscape. So conditions out on the range are not what they were even 20 years ago. And then finally, these are taking into account only horses on BLM land. There are also horses on Forest Service, National Park land, National Wildlife Refuge lands, tribal lands, and private lands. These horses and burros don't necessarily follow boundary lines. Their protections are different depending on where they may happen to roam. And then, of course, we have the mandate of multiple use overlaying all of this. So go ahead to the next slide. Ecologists have used the parameters of resistance and resiliency towards land management since the 1970s. Resilience refers to an ecosystem's ability to recover, and resistance refers to what an ecosystem can handle. Western Great Basin rangeland ecosystems are neither highly resistant nor resilient. Time is not on our side. Consequences of climate change include alterations of forage quantity and quality, overall changes to plant community composition, and decreasing precipitation in already arid, water-limited lands. Without holistic considerations for how many animals and uses the land can sustain, we are bound to continue towards irreversible damage to fragile landscapes. Not to mince words here, but horses and burros are only part of what impacts ecosystems. Overlying this are the changing values of American people. In the early 2000s, Colorado State University and the Fish and Wildlife Service looked at American wildlife values, and most Americans had a traditionalist view of wildlife. But it was there for our use, and culling is part of how we manage animals. But a follow-up study in 2018 showed a complete 180. Americans now have an overwhelmingly mutualistic view of wildlife. Animals are part of our lives, and non-lethal management is highly preferred. In print now is a new study by Colorado State University comparing this to American values of wild horse management. Very similar results. Land managers have the delicate and important job of balancing use, values, and science, not a simple or enviable task. Considering time, climate, sustainability, and acceptability, programmatic application of fertility control control is absolutely necessary to stabilize and manage wild horses and burros on public lands. Next and last slide is just a thank you very much to the Botstiber Institute because they help this wildlife fertility control work to continue. And at this point, if people have questions, I am happy to try to answer them or find the resource to help get it answered.
Thank you, Celeste. So let me remind people of the process for asking questions. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the Q&A tab, which appears on the right side of your screen. You may have to maximize that or size that tab to fully access it. And Celeste will read questions as they come in aloud and answer them verbally for everyone. And if we don't get to your question during the webinar, you can email your question to BIWFC@botstiber.org.
Sue Stuska is hi Sue, is interested in the modeling system that I talked about. So yes, I will send you some information, Sue, and it's kind of twofold. The modeling system that the USGS is working on, which is a lot more robust than what I do. But I'm happy to talk with you through the Excel modeling that I do. We should probably jump on the phone for that. And then I can tell you where the USGS and BLM are with the top Equid, which is that it's in testing right now. And then it has to be peer reviewed before it can kind of go out. And okay, questions are starting to roll in. I have to read them first so that I don't misspeak. Gosh, this is a really good question. I think that participants cannot see all of the questions as they roll in. I'm not certain of that, so I'm going to read this. Is that correct?
Yeah, Celeste.
So does natural selection, i.e. evolution, act on the efficacy of chemical fertility controls, and in what time frames? The reference point, there might be such effects on humans. And there's a link that I'm not going to open because it'll probably stall my computer. That is an excellent question, and I do know there has been some consideration about it. In other words, if you have essentially artificially selected for the continued adaptations of a herd group because you as a human have determined who you're going to apply chemical fertility control to, then are you inadvertently selecting for mares that might not develop an antibody response to whatever vaccine you are giving, if it's a contraceptive vaccine? And do you, in effect, change the reproductive growth rate of that herd group or select for animals that are not going to respond? So there is definitely some thought that has gone into that. I don't know of any studies that have looked at that. So there might be some people on this webinar right now who can type in quickly to me a link to a paper if there is one. But to the person who asked this question, I can definitely try to get that information to have her talk about it.
Celeste, just to clarify for you, you and I can see the list of questions.
Okay.
Not every attendee might be able to see them at once.
And are we going to be able to go back and see these questions afterwards? So if we need to send resources to people, we have their contact?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay. You have another question.
Okay. Oh, this is awesome. Okay, with advances in technology, do you think microchipping horses or wildlife that have been sterilized is an option instead of ear tags or collars? I would like to see this for deer one day. And I said, thank you you. Yes. There's already, well, there's several things here. If you're going to implement any fertility control program, regardless of what it is, you need to know which animals have received which treatment. And in the past, I believe that had been done primarily, as you mentioned, in deer, that's with ear tags. And in the horses, I know that they'll do the freeze branding. And I think neither one of those is terribly acceptable to the general public because you're sort of marking wildlife. So of course there is interest in developing techniques that are not so either bothering the animal, some physical sort of something or other on them that isn't necessarily ideal. And I know of a study right now in deer where they are microchipping them, and then the deer, when they access a feed station, their microchip is close enough to a reader that reader can pick up who that deer is and their treatment history. And then you know if that deer needs to receive a booster or not. I don't know specifically. I do know specifically that there is work looking at facial recognition technology for horses and that has been tricky. There has been successful recognition technology, I believe, used for zebras, but of course they're going to be slightly easier with their patterns. So I know that work is going on. I know that there's deep interest in it. I don't know exactly where anybody is at with any one of those ideas. Are there any differences in cost effectiveness of different types of fertility control, and how large are those differences? Yes, for sure. The difference in a volunteer delivering a dart of one of the ZP protein vaccines to an animal is going to be much different than if an animal has to be gathered via helicopter and processed through a chute and receive some sort of treatment in that way. And there's going to be differences in treatment costs based on if you have to continually retreat or boost versus if you don't, and the time between those boosts, or if you're just capturing an animal once and applying a treatment that is longer acting or permanent. Those differences can be quite large. So then you're getting into weighing, all right, well, how many times is that animal being handled? And if the cost is effectively the same, is there a welfare cost associated with that or not? So for sure, there are large differences between cost effectiveness.
Feel free to type in your question for Celeste. Celeste, I think you have another question that's come in.
What kinds of research projects do you think need to be done other than the project's BLM support? Oh my gosh, that's an excellent question. I think that as one of the participants was asking about, that idea of being able to identify horses without having to tag them in any way, that's something well worth looking into. Being able to identify horses remotely, because if you're going to go into an area where a lot of the horses are very similarly colored or patterned, knowing which ones have received treatment is going to be that much more difficult. And I think definitely there's so much interest in using drones, which gets into tricky territory on public lands. And with the ability for agencies to be able to do that internally, sometimes it's easier for independent groups to utilize drones on public lands than it is for the own agency to. But there is work being done with drones in several different applications, from drones being able to remotely deliver some sort of vaccine to drones being used for moving horses around a bit more quietly. Helicopter helicopter gathers are not popular, as everybody knows. So I think those types of things that can help to progress these fertility control methods, I think are going to be really important, because it's really great that we have several options available. But implementing them is, of course, the hard part. The devil's in the details. Looking for ways to make these methods as implementable as possible. And I think that's going to take some real thought outside of the box. We have another question here. Has your group considered using any other type of fertility control other than PZP? For example, Gonacon. I'm going to speak for Return to Freedom. We've been using PZP for 20 years, and so it is what we are comfortable with, and it works for us. So that's what our decision is based upon. I think the idea of, if we project that out a little bit and we think about what is acceptable for use on our public lands with animals that are federally protected, that's where we get into, I think, those are just much tougher conversations. Obviously, I think any group wants to make certain that any vaccine or methodology that's used on animals on our public lands has been thoroughly vetted. So really looked at deeply, behavioral considerations, looked at handling considerations, the safety of whatever modality is used. And like I was talking about in that last slide, the acceptability and where American people are sort of in our value system that we've placed over wildlife and animals. That all of that has to go into the melting pot when we think about what is going to be acceptable and useful and responsible. And I like to go back to those parameters that were developed with years of thought and experience and research behind them. And one of the things that's important is that it be zero to very little behavioral influence. So those things need to be that. And again, I'm not saying anything for or against any particular method. I'm just saying you really have to dig into these things. It's really nuanced. I definitely go back and forth about some ideas that I have just personally about thinking about how do they fit into those parameters. So it's just not straightforward.
Celeste?
Yep.
Can I ask you a little bit about delivery systems
Uh-huh.
and administration of agents? Like, what are current options and what might be available in the future?
Well, current options are going to have to be methods that have been approved of through the NEPA process and that have been registered and are compliant with whatever government agency. In the case thus far, it's been the EPA. So when we look at what is available right now for use, those are vaccines that I think two of the three, I might be wrong. There might be someone who can chime in with that. I'll see the comment and I can update this answer. But I believe two of the three of the vaccines available now and cleared by the EPA can be delivered remotely via a dart gun. I think one of them may still have to be hand injected. That might not be the case. It may be the case that all three of them can be delivered remotely, in which case that is usable in an area where horses are tractable, you can approach within whatever your range is of the particular weight of your dart and how much vaccine is necessary in that dart. Generally, the closer the better, because if you're going to need to dart them again, you taught them where that limitation is. So if you start darting them really far away, then they're going to go further away the next time. So these are things that go into your mechanisms for how you would deliver these vaccines. And then also, of course, you can hand inject any of these. So a horse can be put into a livestock chute and applied a treatment. Then, of course, you have to capture that horse either via a helicopter or a bait and trap situation. I know right now there's a project happening in Arizona looking at how feasible it is to dart burros with immunocontraceptive vaccine, and that they are utilizing bait trapping for that. So that's been useful in that application. And they are also remotely darting just as they're seeing these animals on the range. And not 100% certain of that. Stephanie may be able to weigh in. And then other applications that are coming down the line that are interesting are other types of vaccines that might be longer acting, or that might just need one dose. And that will lead into real deep analysis of the decisions of which animals would receive that. Because if you're going to have some sort of vaccine that is effective with just one dose, you're essentially sterilizing that animal. So that obviously has to be taken into consideration, which is, yet more proof that managing animals on public lands is just really layered and not so straightforward. And then, there's interest in if there are any sorts of oral applications, but when you get into that, you get into concerns for the ability to become bioaccumulative. So anything that needs to be eaten needs to be able to get through the digestive process of an animal, which generally, but I don't think in every case means that that drug is going to reside in the tissues of the animal. So then if that animal dies or something feeds from it, that animal too is exposed to that dose or a dose. So there's those. And then this is a great comment that I'm going to read aloud so everybody can hear. Just want to encourage people to get out and volunteer. Volunteers can help bring the costs of fertility control down. Too often public officials like to downplay fertility control because of the costs. Help animals, it's a win-win for animals. And I would like to second that idea of volunteering and becoming involved. There are some very successful public and nonprofit partnerships. You can go to the Science and Conservation Center's website to read about getting trained and in applying fertility control remotely. And they can also help you to find if there are groups nearby to where you might live that are engaged in this work. And that's another plug for this. It's really important to work in a healthy and positive manner with your public agencies. Because if we're going to demand these partnerships be happening and we want them to be sustainable and to work, we need to work alongside them as much as possible towards these really great public, nonprofit, private partnerships that exist already or have the potential to.
I'd like to thank Celeste for presenting to all of us today. Thank you for taking the time to do this.
Of course, and thanks folks for signing up. And again, truly, I do want to refine this presentation and add more information and ideas. Of course, it could easily be a many days long presentation, but really happy to get people's comments or stories or parts of the history that you think have been left out. I am going to try to keep working on this.
Yeah, and I'd like to tell everyone that today's webinar will be posted on the Botstiber Institute's website at www.wildlifefertilitycontrol.org. And our previous webinars are there as well. Thanks to all of you who joined us today. And I hope you follow the Botstiber Institute on Facebook and Twitter, and just join our mailing list if you're not already there. Celeste, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll conclude the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.